Of people have been receiving a special COVID-19 relief grants to help them through this time. And you know how important getting money into households is at the moment. During the tough lockdown, we saw around 2 million jobs being lost. Many people still not working, many people still unemployed. The economy much smaller than it was 2 years ago, before the pandemic. Niel Coleman is the co-director at the Institute for Economic Justice. Neil, good afternoon to you. You're calling for the grants to be extended. What will happen if government doesn't extend the grants?
Well, Stephen, we have to bear in mind, and good afternoon, we have to bear in mind that 6 million South Africans without any form of income were receiving this grant until the end of April. And if we take conservatively that each beneficiary has around 2 dependents, you can see that at least 18 million South Africans are affected by the removal of this grant. If you add to that the 7 million caregivers who were mainly women who received a grant until the end of October and their beneficiaries, between these two grants, you actually are impacting on roughly half of the South African population in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, with hunger rising. The NITS-CRAM surveys, which showed the impact of the crisis of the pandemic on families, has shown extreme hunger amongst many households. And so this is a recipe for raising hunger. It's a recipe for raising desperation and anger in our communities. And it's simply difficult to understand why government would take this decision when we are facing a third wave of the pandemic, and in which many of the jobs which have been lost have not been regained. The estimate is that about 1.4 million jobs have been lost since the beginning of 2020. So it really is a crisis situation.
I mean, I'll never forget the findings that we found last year during the hard lockdown of how many parents were going to bed hungry to make sure that their children had enough food. Children in particular are very vulnerable at this time. I mean, if I've understood the numbers correctly, around 1.5 million children who received school meals before the lockdown are still not getting their meals now. This means that if there's now less income for them, their situation just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, it's a crisis. Stephen, as you say, parents are going to bed hungry so that their children can eat. But many children are, despite that, actually not getting enough food to sustain them, which has major implications for education, for social development, and so on. And this is why the stop-start approach of introducing grants, extending them for a few months, terminating them, is creating a huge amount of anxiety and uncertainty in communities. We need to extend the grant for a decent period of time, for at least a year, incorporate the caregivers who've been excluded, and use that time to plan for the introduction of a universal basic income for adult South Africans who are currently not included in the social safety net. So it's very difficult to understand what is happening amongst policymakers. The Minister of Social Development stated a couple of days ago that she had applied to National Treasury for an extension of the grant till next year. That would cost a small amount of something like 23 billion rand, which out of a $1 trillion rand budget is a tiny amount. And we've seen that government, despite claiming that they don't have access to the resources, have extended this grant twice for a 6-month period. So, why is it that technocrats in Treasury are taking decisions which are having a devastating impact on millions and millions of South Africans? And whatever you think of SASSA and DSD, and they have made many mistakes, and they've created enormous frustration amongst beneficiaries. What they have done is that they've extended grants to millions and millions of poor South Africans, and there's been minimal corruption. The grants have got into people's hands, and therefore this is an absolutely essential lifeline which policymakers should be welcoming and consolidating rather than creating this unbelievable insecurity and anxiety in society.
I hear your argument, Neil, and I'm not disagreeing with it. But if I were, for argument's sake, wearing a suit as a Treasury technocrat, the argument against you might go along these lines. You might say, well, if we extend grants again, then when that grant comes to an end, let's just say at the end of the year, there'll be more pressure to continue with the grant, and de facto, in fact, we will have created a basic income grant. Now, that may or may not be the right thing. We'll put the morality of that to one side for a moment. I'm very aware of your views. I don't disagree with them. But the point I'm trying to make is that could government be very worried that it will become impossible to remove this grant politically, and that then, while you say it would only cost 23 billion rand now, and only 23 billion rand, government would be locked into this kind of payment in the longer term? Could that be the concern?
Yes, I mean, definitely, Stephen, in the discussions that have taken place with technocrats in Treasury, as well as in presidency over the last year, this concept of irreversibility that you've spoken about has been raised. But the problem is not around, that people are going to expect it and you've got to extend it. The problem is around the structural fault lines in our society, that half our population, more than half our population, are living in poverty, that over 11 million people are unemployed, that we're in the middle of a pandemic, that there's no prospect at this point of creating full employment. Yes, we've got to combine employment policies, industrial policies, and macroeconomic policies with these social protection measures. But, studies around the world show that grants and social protection measures are not simply handouts. They're not just simply welfare payments, which are a waste of state resources. They're actually an investment in communities, and they actually have many multipliers and beneficial impacts which have been documented around the world. So it's got to be seen from this point of view. And ultimately, these are not technical decisions taken by people trying to balance a budget. These are decisions taken, political decisions and policy decisions, taken by a government wrestling with the massive inequality and poverty in our society. And it's been clearly shown the benefit of these grants. The main problem of the grants actually is the level of insecurity, that they're not going to enough people, but also they're pegged at too low a level. So there needs to be a coherent overhaul of our social protection system. But in the meantime, we face a humanitarian crisis, and therefore, a temporary extension of the grants while this overall restructuring of the system takes place is what is required. And government has said, and the president have said, that they're looking at the implementation of a universal basic income grant. That will take time. So extending this for a year will allow for those processes to unfold, and that's what needs to take place. And now, not the chopping and changing, stopping and starting of these grants, which is causing immense problems in our society.
Neil, I'm fascinated by this issue, and it's a slightly higher level analysis, which is around the fact that we have the highest inequality in the world. It's racialized inequality, of course. You would think in a democracy that the demand for a basic income grant from voters would be immense, frankly, and I think it probably is immense, and yet it hasn't happened. And I'm talking about, the idea of a basic income grant in South Africa goes back to the mid to late 1990s. It's now, during the height of the pandemic, become something that even the United States has done. The federal government has given people checks of $1,000 per household to try and help them get through. I'm actually continually surprised that we haven't had a basic income grant in the past, if you look at the politics of it.
Yeah, and I think it's partly this sort of ideology of the notion that consumption expenditure is wasteful. When you spend money on people in the form of income or public servants, etc., that is a wasteful expenditure. And when you spend money on infrastructure, on hard investments, that is productive investment. Now, this notion has been discredited internationally, but our policymakers, particularly our economic policymakers in Treasury, are lagging behind the rest of the world on this. And as you correctly say, if you look at Biden's, renewal program, economic renewal program, it's very much about combining this question of relief measures with pumping stimulus into the economy with hard infrastructure investments. These things need to be complementary and work together. Some of our policymakers have come around to this view, and there are many in the ANC who are currently looking at this. You know, the ANC has asked for a report in the next few weeks on this particular matter. There are people in presidency and the Department of Social Development who support this view. So it's not like there's one view. It's been a matter of some contestation. But as you say, given the crisis, it's surprising that it's being dragged out for so long, given the obvious need for this in our society.
Niel Coleman, thanks very much indeed. Do appreciate it. Very, very important conversation going on at the moment. Of course, takes us to the conversation around whether our society should have a basic income grant or not.